Testing, testing, mic test, 1, 2, mic test, 1, 2. Hello and welcome to MTO Sociology. This is the third part of our Intro to Sociology course. Today we're going to be looking at family, why it's such an important topic, and why we have to study it in sociology. This is one of the topics where students traditionally do very well on. Maybe it's because it's always the first topic in the first paper they sit. Maybe it's because everyone has a family, so it's easier to relate to. I don't know. But I find it incredibly fascinating. It's one of my favourite parts of sociology. The first question we need to answer is, why do we need or have families? It may seem like we've always had families, humans have always lived in families. And that's true in some respects, but if you look at early cultures, or perhaps your very remote, undiscovered cultures, if there are any left now, they tend to live in tribes, large groups, and not everyone was a blood relation necessarily. But the idea of the nuclear family is fairly modern and really comes to the fore in the 20th century, you could say. So the idea of a family, functionists would argue, is primary socialization and reproduction. The biological process of having kids so that society continues is fairly obvious. Living in a family is all about primary socialization. It's about learning how to fit into society. It's learning about what are the norms and values, what is your culture, what are your traditions, how do you become a functioning adult essentially within a society. So that would be something functionalism would be very concerned with. So defining the family is important. Most people think of the family as mum, dad, kids, blood relations, marriage, and that's the traditional nuclear family. That's the norm for most people in Western society particularly. But there are lots of different types of family. There are single parents, there are extended families where you have another generation, such as grandparents living within the same house. There are now homosexual couples who will have children thanks to changes in the law, changes in values. And there are non-married parents, there are, as we said, single parents, and there are people who don't live in a family at all for various reasons. And this is what we call family diversity, and something that the Rappaports look at when we come to their study. So generally speaking, we will define different family types, and then we may want to ask, why do we consider the nuclear family type the norm? Is it because it's the best? Some sociologists would say yes, some would say no. And that's something that we'll come on to next. So here we have two diagrams, one of the traditional nuclear family, one of the beanpole family. The concept of the beanpole family is something that people seem to remember maybe because of the funny name. If you look at the traditional nuclear family, you can see heterosexual couples, male and female, reproducing, having children. They marry people from different families, they have children, etc., etc. The generations are continued into that family tree. If you look at the beanpole family, you tend to have very few people in each generation, single children often, single parents, and the easiest example may be, particularly if you're a geographer, is to think of the one-child policy in China, where the state enforced beanpole families effectively. So this phenomena tends to look at things like birth rates and why birth rates go up or go down and what that means for a society too. So the structure of the family is just as important as the type, as who's in it, applying cages to a family, etc., etc. So sometimes you may want to think about, what does the structure tell us automatically about a family? What can we infer from it? So I mentioned the Rappaports earlier. They're a husband and wife who did a very famous study on family diversity, and they looked also at life cycle diversity, why a family might change. So your role within your family may change over time. Obviously you may be a child at one point, a sibling, you then become an adult yourself. You may live alone for a time, you may marry, you may not, you may have kids, you may become a grandparent, etc., etc. And throughout your life, your role within your family will change. But there are other reasons why a family can change. The social class you're in, and perhaps social mobility, who you live with, who you marry, the law, the policies of a government, as well as class. It could be poverty or wealth. Death and divorce are the two big reasons usually. obviously if a couple gets divorced, it changes the structure of their family, it changes who they live with, and if someone dies, likewise. So you can check this against changes in society, changes in the law. The Divorce Act from the 60s is an obvious answer for questions on divorce. But where did that come from? Why was it coming into law? Will change in attitudes or change in norms? So this is something you may want to think about. A family is never really fixed. It changes over time, it changes between generations too. The nuclear family obviously dominates this topic because it's seen as the norm, it's the starting point. And functionalists are very positive about the nuclear family for many reasons. But some of the benefits of a nuclear family is financial stability. This traditional nuclear family where the husband's the breadwinner and goes out to work and the wife looks after the kids was seen as normal, was seen as perfect in the early to the mid 20th century. Feminists have questioned this, Marxists have questioned this, based on class and gender discrimination, inequalities, that type of thing. Functionalists particularly, and the New Right, would say the nuclear family offers strength and stability. You get both male and female socialization, you get a sense of identity and a sense of kind of common purpose across society, things like that. So they're very positive about the nuclear family. And likewise, the critics, the feminists and the Marxists, are very negative because of those reasons. So here you can see a further list of advantages and disadvantages to the nuclear family. So a nuclear family is a kind of self-contained unit, if you like. You don't have to have contact with other family members. You don't have to take care of the grandparents. You can choose who looks after your children. You can choose basically how you live your life, essentially. And it's more affordable, in theory. Disadvantages, though, you may miss other family members. Like my family, we live quite a way away from my parents and my wife's parents. So regularly seeing them every day is impossible. Grandparents can miss out on things. We can miss out on things with our families back home, as it were. So although the nuclear family can be perfect, it doesn't always work in the way it used to. If you think about Marx's time in the industrial family or the pre-industrial family, they're often extended families or big families that lived, sometimes in one house or shared one room. It depends on which era of history you're studying, and that had different connotations and different advantages and disadvantages. One of the best sources of evidence of how society sees a nuclear family is the media, in particularly adverts. If you look at what's being advertised and to who, it can tell you a lot about how we see the nuclear family. Think about things like cleaning products. They're often targeted at women, they're often targeted at mothers, and the implication being that if you buy this, you're a good mother, you're doing the right thing for your kids. Likewise, look at how men are portrayed in adverts. They're often comedy figures in relation to a sensible mother figure, or they are targeted with certain goods and certain things which will increase their masculinity and sort of confirm their role as the breadwinner. Likewise, you want to think about a term called pester power. Things that are advertised towards kids tend to encourage them to pester their parents to buy it. So we've got things like cereals with cartoons, we've got the Happy Meals with the bright colours, the toys, etc, etc. The idea being that children will see this, will want it, and will pester their parents into buying it. Someone like Zaretsky, who's a Marxist, would see this as evidence of the family being a unit of consumption. The whole structure of the nuclear family means that everyone in it is able to be exploited, to spend money, to try and show their status, to try and live up to an expectation or a norm, which confirms their role. So when you're watching adverts, when you're watching TV, when you're watching films, see if you can spot certain patterns or certain trends or certain stereotypes, as it were, around different people within the family. Linking to adverts, here's two different adverts from two different periods which show how housework is shared in the family. So the earlier one from the 1950s, completely targeted at women, links women as housewife to women as kind of object of beauty, as it were, and how their product will help them fulfill both roles. The modern advert plays on these stereotypes much later. It's from a couple of years ago, and it talks about couples discussing who does what, and the joke constantly being the man does way less than he says he does or thinks that he does. So This comes into conjugal roles, it comes into ideas around the symmetrical family versus the traditional family, and you can see it in change over time, the attitudes from the mid-20th century up until now. Another important area on this topic is the dark side of the family. You can see here a past paper question where you've got an item on domestic violence. You've also got the statistic here about domestic abuse. And what you'll tend to find is that the dark side of the family is something which most people won't automatically come to mind and won't want to talk about for obvious reasons. So again, you can link this to research methods and ethical considerations. But we're really talking about the negative aspects. So feminists will talk about how men assert patriarchy, assert their dominance through violence or the threat of violence. This can also be abuse of children, it can be abuse of partners, and it doesn't just work in a patriarchal sense. Statistics show that there's a huge rise in the reporting of men as the victim of domestic violence. Now that might tell us something about stigma and shame, or it might tell us something about a change. Why are we hearing now more reports of men being a victim? Again, you may want to think about this, you may want to research this and see how you can apply it to different questions, particularly essays, and be aware it may come up in items and it may come up in research methods too when you get to that part of the family questions. The last thing you'll need to be aware of is facts about marriage. I really like this graph because it shows really neatly the changes over time in terms of attitudes, and it uses statistical data to help illustrate it. So if you look at the period around World War II, when it comes to marriages, they spike massively as people go off to war. They slump hugely while the men are away at war and the women are on the home front doing those jobs, etc., etc. And then it's fairly steady. Then you've got the Divorce Act in the 60s. And after that, you can see late 20th century, marriages start to slump and divorces start to rise. Now, this might be because divorce is more available to all classes. It might be a change in norms and expectations, lifestyles, technologies, etc., etc. The graph stops just before the Family Act, which introduced gay marriage in 2013. So around 2012 to 2013, you see civil partnerships have already come in, but these aren't marriages. So homosexuals can't get married until just off the graph, really. With that as well, marriage and divorces don't tell us if it's first or second time, or even third or fourth time for people getting married and divorced. So how much of that is likely to make up these numbers is difficult to say. But what you need to be aware of is over time, the expectation to get married young has gone away, it's changing. And people are making more choices, have more freedom when it comes to marriage and divorce. So that can tell us a lot. As always, thank you very much for listening. I really appreciate that. If you have any questions or comments, please let me know. Please contact me. See me in class. I hope you found this video useful.